Hey guys, I'm Urizi. This story is all about what if Naruto was a genius and was born with a red hair. Naruto was born with hair as red as his mother's, but with a face and intellect that paralleled his father, the Fourth Hokage. Will the revolution he brings be the world's salvation or destruction? Before we proceed with the story, please like and subscribe to this channel if you liked the video, and don't forget to check the description for the other works of the author if you liked the story. Let's start. Chapter 21, Earth-Shaking Matter. You must be Nine Tails. What do you want? Came the rumbling reply. Lend me your chakra, said Naruto. Otherwise, we'll both die. The claws that had been futilely swiping at Naruto from between the bars froze in midair, and then without any warning, the being behind the gates burst into a deep and rasping laugh that, as it resounded across the brackish water, raised the hairs on the back of his neck. True, if you get killed here, that'd be inconvenient for me. You've got guts, if anything. Very well then. Here is a gift for coming this far. Man, I'm sick and tired of this stupid patrol duty, said the man, making a spitting sound. Naruto felt his eyes narrow. The roiling bloodlust he was exuding was even stronger than Naruto could remember it being just 2 years ago in Yogakure. It could have felt that way due to the sheer vastness and emptiness of their surroundings, but nevertheless, if it had been a single storm cloud before, it was now a tempest. You think I want to be here wasting my time? Replied another man's gravelly voice. Who are you? Name your purpose. Naruto heard Mayu speak up bravely beside him, and he realized she must not have recognized the man. We're not supposed to let ninja in this area, said the man he had identified as Hidan, ignoring the first part of her question. So we're going to kill you. Or actually, Kakuzu, how about you stay out of this and let me have some fun? Naruto slowly began to reach for the tanto strapped to his back, thankful for the darkness. It seemed that Hidan had not recognized them either, but what could he mean by not supposed to? And who was the other ninja? Hidan had called him Kakuzu, with him. From the sounds of their voices, I doubt any of them would even fetch a price at the bounty office, grunted Kakuzu, sounding wholly dissatisfied. Rai let out a nervous laugh. Whoa, ease up man. Let's not be too hasty. Don't you know who we are? Ha. The boss told us to rendezvous with you guys here, Rai continued, his voice remarkably smooth. Well, he did mean you guys, right? This seemed to give Hidan actual pause. For a split second, as if a dog had just caught the scent of something other than its prey, the thick bloodlust wavered. And in that same instant, Naruto formed the clone seal. Kage Bunshin no Jutsu, Shadow Clone Technique. Accompanied by the sounds of exploding smoke, 10 physical copies of Naruto solidified into existence, each one bearing a readied tanto in hand. Go, he said, and his clones burst forward in the direction where he sensed Hidan and Kakuzu. In response, as they'd practiced, he heard the high-pitched warbling of bluebirds as they freed themselves from Mayu's hair and the telltale rustling of paper as Sai drew out his scrolls. 4 o'clock, Rai. Mayu cried out, and from Rai's direction came the sound of hissing, and then the whistling sound of deadly metal flying through air, followed up by a string of explosions. Slightly averting his eyes from the brief orange glows of the blasts, Naruto saw on the floor ink black snakes wriggling straight into the resultant smoke. In theory, it was a simple tactic. Using his clones to first surround and herd the enemy, Mayu would use her bluebirds to confuse them, and in the case where they didn't have any visual information on their targets, to gain intel on their whereabouts. Rai would follow up with exploding tags to further confuse them, and in the resultant disorder, Sai would bind them with his ink snakes. Then, in theory, Naruto and Rai could go in and finish off whoever was left. He blinked, processing the newly gained memory of one of his clones who had just been destroyed. In the fleeting glimpse the clone had gotten from the light of the exploding tags, neither Hidan nor the other man seemed particularly perturbed by the commotion they had just set off. However, Naruto had never expected it to. Now, Naruto said. As the others disappeared using the shunshin, he dashed toward the cloud of smoke with his tanto raised in his hand. In the passing split seconds as he approached its center, his remaining clones began to leap out of the smoke, their tanto at the ready. Naruto's brow furrowed as he urged a current of lightning chakra, now almost as second nature to him as his wind chakra had been, to run through his body, and then simultaneously, he and his clones thrust their tanto into the boggy ground below. Blue and pure white sparks lit up the watery surface, as with a crackling sound, the earth broke into pieces, consuming anything still remaining on its surface. Naruto's clones exploded in sequential clouds of smoke, but Naruto himself had long since flashed away. The night clouds had momentarily drawn back, allowing through a few stray rays of moonlight to light his way. Touching back down and running as fast as he could in the direction they'd been headed, Naruto soon caught up to the rest of his team. With chakra powering their feet, they were running in spearhead formation with Mayu at its head. "How much of a lead do we have?" Rai hissed, as Naruto quietly drew beside him. Naruto drew another tanto from his back. "Not much," he said shortly. "The moon's back out, and it'll be hard to lose them in open space." "Where are we headed?" "My birds tell me there's a forest about 3 kilometers ahead of here," said Mayu, casting an anxious eye back. Lifting his head, Naruto looked straight forward, but even with some of his vision restored, most of the horizon was still a haze of dark outlines and blackness. "But, why are they even chasing us?" "I'm not sure," Naruto admitted. Hidan hadn't seemed to have recognized them even after their exchange, so it couldn't be some twisted form of vengeance. And it didn't seem to be out of malicious boredom either. He and his partner had some sort of ulterior motive in mind. "Maybe they've given up," said Rai in a hopeful tone. But even before he'd finished talking, all 4 of them stiffened as a voice howled from behind them. "And where the hell do you think you're going?" They fell silent, straining their ears as if they would be able to hear the approaching footsteps of their pursuers. The wind was blowing in their faces, and Naruto thought grimly of how it must be carrying their scents back. "We'll be killed if we only run like this," said Sai matter-of-factly, sounding as serious as Naruto had ever heard him. "And killed if we fight them head-on," Rai muttered. "We need another diversion, a better one. Until we can reach the forest." I can try staving them off with my birds," said Mayu. "No," said Rai immediately in a brusque voice. "They'd break you as soon as they were upon you." "Mayu, that's the guy who took on Kakashi-sensei back in Yogakure and survived, and this time, he's got a buddy with him." Mayu's control over her bluebirds worked best when she was physically near them. While they could instantaneously process information over a distance of up to 5 kilometers, actually channeling her genjutsu through them was only possible when she was within a radius of 100 feet of them. The others had all turned to Naruto for his orders. As his thoughts raced over their options, he felt his pulse rate begin to pick up. If they continued to simply flee toward the forest, Hidan and Kakuzu would catch up before then. But at the same time, Naruto couldn't ask any one of them to stay behind in order to distract the two to make time for the others. That would essentially be condemning them to death. But what other choices were left to him then? Should they try fighting head-on with Hidan and his partner, despite not knowing the extent of their combative abilities? Naruto glanced at Mayu and Rai's pale but determined faces, and felt his throat go dry. "Well, Naruto?" Rai prompted him. "This is what we're going to do," he said at last. The Wet Dog was one of the better-known taverns along the pier, with the best sake found anywhere along the coastline, or so the drunk sailor that Jiraiya had interrogated claimed, anyways. And so, he found himself sitting down behind the countertop, swirling warmed sake around in a cup while keeping an eye out in the crowd for anyone who looked like they could be by themselves. Soon enough, with a scraping sound, a flushed-looking man dressed in the telltale, and rather threadbare, cotton coat of a fisherman settled into the wooden chair beside him. Flagging the barman down with a finger, the man let out a loud hiccup. His unfocused eyes traveled across the bottles and flasks of sake behind the counter, before moving on to his neighbors. When Jiraiya felt the drunk man's eyes on him, he looked down at his cup, before taking a sip from it. "You a foreigner?" The fisherman slurred, leaning his face haphazardly against his hand. "Where from?" "Fire, Heek, country, by the looks of it." Jiraiya made a non-committal sound, and put his cup down on the countertop. "How about you?" "Born and raised in Wave," the fisherman hiccuped. "You fish for a living?" "Among other things." The barman had brought him a small plate of fried seaweed and octopus, and he began to chew at it, making an audible crunching sound even over the din of the tavern. "Other things?" Jiraiya repeated. "Crunch." "Can't survive," Here no more doing just one thing. Economy not doing well? Yeah, this place is gone to the dogs. Crunch, market might as well be non-existent, lucky to get 100 ryo for an entire shipment of fish, even. Jiraiya let out a whistle. For an entire shipment? Sounds rough. Tell me about it, the fisherman let out a grunt, bobbing his head. If I had anywhere else to go, I certainly wouldn't still be here. Jiraiya traced the rim of his cup with a finger. Still, you sound like you're doing rather well for yourself. Well, I pay my dues, yeah? That's the secret to survival around here, if you know what I mean. As drunk as he was, the fisherman had lowered his voice with a furtive look around, but the barman was serving another customer at the other end of the counter. Huh, said Jiraiya, injecting as much admiration as he could into the single syllable. The thing is, everyone knows the daimyo ain't in control no more, yeah? It's the gangs who run the place now. It's all about staying on their good side. The fisherman broke off to noisily pop another octopus leg into his mouth, and as Jiraiya waited for him to continue, he watched as it was crushed into bits between the man's yellowed teeth. You don't get in their way, crunch, and you give them what they want, and they'll leave you alone long enough to scrape enough ryo together to buy a night's stay in bed and some sake for your belly. The man broke into a raucous laugh, and patted his stomach. Jiraiya followed with a rumbling laugh, holding his sake cup to the other man's face. You seem like a sensible sort of man, say, you wouldn't happen to know, would you? If I wished to invite some fairer company into my bed without fearing for my neck around here. The fisherman immediately placed a knowing hand on Jiraiya's shoulder, having recognized a brother in need. You need speak no further, my good man. You'll be glad to know that with just one word, you'll be guaranteed a restful night anywhere around here. Oh? And what's that? The man grinned, his teeth gleaming in the sickly light. Akatsuki. Immediately, Jiraiya had to stop himself from reacting to the name, giving the fisherman only a small nod of acknowledgement. With forcibly stilled hands, he raised the sake cup to his mouth, draining the rest of it. Akatsuki. The criminal organization that Jiraiya had devoted so many years of his life to researching, the organization that Orochimaru had joined after defecting from Konoha, could they truly be operating here? In Wave Country? Whatever the case, one thing was certain, his decision to stay behind in Wave Country had been the right thing to do. Something big involving Akatsuki was about to go down, and there was a good chance it had everything to do with the current fiasco with Geto. Jiraiya hadn't been sure what he would do after discerning the cause behind the country's ruination. There was a limit to even what he could do, but now that he knew the Akatsuki had a hand in this place, he knew he had to do something, even if that something only involved further intelligence gathering. That was what he had been doing all these years, after all, even going so far as to let down the third's hopes of him taking up the mantle of Hokage. But inasmuch as it had been his determination to retrieve Orochimaru, it had also been for his home, Konoha. Because no matter how many years it had been since he'd actually been there, when it came down to it, Jiraiya would never let down Konoha, even at the cost of his life. Are you sure about this, Naruto? Mayu asked uneasily, as she took off her cloak. You do know that if they don't fall for it, we'll be sitting ducks. I know. Naruto took off his cloak, and immediately, he felt goosebumps rising on his arms as the harsh wind bit into them. To be fair, that Hidan guy doesn't seem to be the brightest bulb in the box, said Rai, his own cloak already tucked under his arm. His partner gave me some bad vibes though. What was his name again? Kakuzu. Kakuzu, Sai answered, and the others turned to him. He's an S-rank missing nin from Takigakuer. How do you know that? Rai asked, looking rather taken aback. He's been listed in the bingo book for quite some time now. Rai opened his mouth to question him further, as it were mostly Jonin and Umbu who held bingo books, but Naruto held up a hand. Enough. Later. Focus on the mission at hand now. Are you all ready? He looked at each of his teammates in turn, and with focus refilling their expressions, they nodded. With a nod back, he brought his hands together in the clone seal, Kage Bunshin no Jutsu. With puffs of identical clouds of smoke, a dozen Narutos fell into place on the ground beside them, matching their punishing pace. Naruto, the real one, flung his cloak at the pair nearest him, and one immediately tugged the hood over himself. At the same time, Mayu and the others also threw their cloaks at a pair of clones, until there were 4 clones wearing each of their cloaks. With every cloaked clone paired with one without, all 12 of his clones shot off into slightly different directions, but headed ultimately for the forest. "See you too soon," Rai muttered, before turning sharply on his heel and heading east away from the forest. Sai, with a reluctant glance back at Naruto, quickly followed suit. "Stay safe," Mayu whispered back, her voice shaking like a leaf in the wind. Naruto heard her step into place beside him as they ran in the opposite direction, west. The forest was large, even though they weren't headed directly for it. The black mass of trees grew rapidly bigger and bigger as they closed the distance. Without their cloaks, the chilly night wind struck harshly into their faces as they raced along the marsh, the cold bug water seeping into their sandals. Naruto looked back, but there appeared to be nothing there beside the long stretch of marshland they had just crossed. The bloodlust too had faded, leaving behind just the beating of his heart in his chest, and the shallow breathing of Mayu running next to him. "Have your birds found them?" he asked Mayu, who brought her hands together to make the bird seal. "They can't get near without being detected, but it looks like Hidan is headed straight for the forest," she said, her voice tinged with relief. "And Kakuzu? None of them see him." "All right. Keep the bird on Hidan, but make sure it's not detected, and keep the other birds searching for Kakuzu." "Have Rai and Sai reached the end of the forest yet?" "They've just reached the other end," Mayu confirmed. "They'll be out of range soon." "Good, keep your birds with them for as long as you," Naruto broke off and his eyes widened. Without even enough time to shout, he raised up his tanto to protect himself. With a grunt, Naruto had just barely managed to raise it in time before a powerful kick slammed into the flat side of his blade, sending him flying backward. Still struggling to hold his tanto in front of him, Naruto dug the heels of his sandals into the ground and felt the wet earth wedging alongside his soles from the sheer force behind the kick. Finally, he came to a stop, his legs covered with cold slabs of mud. "What happened?" he heard Mayu gasp. The dark figure that had attacked him out of seemingly nowhere hadn't followed him, choosing instead to cross his arms and regard Naruto with an almost leisurely interest. "You're quite fast on your feet," said a deep voice. It was the one who had been with Hidan, the one named Kakuzu. It was still too dark to make out his features. All Naruto could make out in the dim light was a dark, bulky outline. "How did you find us so quickly?" Naruto asked, his heart pounding in his ears. "I commend you for thinking of using the wind in your favor as quickly as you did. I'll admit, I was fooled at first, thinking the 4 of you had split and headed separately for the forest. In fact, I'm pretty sure my idiot of a partner is even now still headed for the forest. But unfortunately for you two, I'm not him." With that, Kakuzu suddenly shot forward, heading straight toward them, but this time, Naruto was ready. He held his hand out before him, urging his chakra together. Rapidly, streams of blue light began to encircle his palm, swirling faster and faster until it had formed a tight ball. Digging his heels into the earth, Naruto sent lightning chakra into his feet, igniting his nerves, and with an explosive sound, he too kicked off, raising his hand into the air to meet Kakuzu. "So you're a ninja, big guy." The girl he had fondly nicknamed Grapefruit Breast slapped lightly at his knee, rubbing her namesake against his arms. She was dressed in a Chinese-style kipao dress that was slit dangerously high up along her thigh. "Gwahahaha. I'm not just a ninja," Jiraiya let out a loud laugh, his face flushed red with sake. "I'm one of the legendary Sunin, they call me Jiraiya the Great Toad Sage." "Wow, a Sunin," gushed the identically dressed blonde girl on his other side, who he'd tenderly nicknamed Bubble Butt. She paused, tapping a manicured nail against her plump lips. "What's that again, Fukumi?" "Gush Fukuyu, don't you know? It's like, you know, that communist guy. Stalin," said Bubble Butt dubiously. Jiraiya had no idea what they were talking about. "Women," he thought affectionately. Following the advice of the fisherman he'd met at the Wet Dog, Jiraiya had soon managed to find himself in the shadowy region of the harbor city, where he'd been welcomed with open arms into the private room of a slightly more trashed bar. Guzzling down fried squid and vats of sake with a beautiful woman on each arm, Jiraiya was having a hard time remembering what he'd been so serious about just hours ago. "So what are you here in Wave Country for?" Grapefruit Breasts had returned her attention to Jiraiya, and was now lazily stroking his chest with her long nails. "What else but to meet you ladies?" Jiraiya said as smoothly as possible, an effect that was slightly ruined by his missing his mouth with his cup, spilling some sake on his shoulder instead. "Oh, you're so silly." Bubblebutt giggled. "Let me guess, you're on some super top secret ninja mission, aren't you?" "I can't say," Jiraiya said regretfully, closing his eyes in sorrow. "If I did tell you, I'd have to kill you. And if you two ladies were gone from this world, what meaning would be left to living?" The two women burst into high-pitched giggling, clutching at his arms. "You can tell us. None of us will remember in the morning, anyways," Grapefruit Breasts said in a sing-song voice, this time rubbing her breasts along the nape of Jiraiya's neck. "Not after what we plan on doing with you, anyways." Bubblebutt breathed into his ear, her breath coming out hotly against his skin. At her words, Jiraiya's eyes widened and he fell into a fit of coughing. When he'd finally regained his breath, he wheezed, "So, where were we? But first, what's the magic word?" Grapefruit Breasts jumped up on his back playfully and wrapped her arms around his neck. "The magic word." He blinked. Bubblebutt wrapped her arms around his arm possessively. "You know, the word you have to say to get anywhere here." "Wahaha. Oh, that one," he said, thinking back to the fisherman with bad teeth. Grapefruit Breast's cold fingers caressed his face. "Yes, that one. Akatsuki, wasn't it?" Jiraiya said lightly. "Wrong," Bubblebutt hissed. Jiraiya's eyes widened, but before he could do anything, Grapefruit Breast's weak grip on his head immediately turned iron strong and she twisted her hands, snapping his neck. At the same time, with a flash of gleaming steel, Bubblebutt's hand slashed across the front of his exposed neck. Warm blood spurted out, dotting her expressionless face with red. The two women let go of the Sunin and backed away. With a thud, the body dropped to the floor of the room. The white hair fanning around it added a sense of finality to their deed. "See," said the blonde, looking down at the body with a slight sneer on her face. There was nothing to be nervous about. Her partner poked the body with the heel of her pumps. "Zabuza-sama said he'd be strong, though. Give a ninja a woman and some sake and he's only a man," the blonde said sagely. "I guess so, are you sure he was a Sunin?" "That would be as not was," said a voice from behind them. Stiffening in shock, the blonde let out a cry of alarm, but before she could do anything else, something long and white had wrapped itself around both of the girls' bodies, immobilizing them. Squirming fruitlessly to free themselves, they saw before them the ninja they had just killed regarding them with a grave look on his face. "But how?" cried out the blonde. She looked down at the ground, just in time to see the dead Sunin and the puddle of blood explode into a cloud of smoke, leaving nothing behind. Her heart pounding painfully against her ample chest, she slowly raised her eyes to meet the other ninjas, and what she saw there made her tremble. "Now ladies," said Jiraiya. "Where were we?" Missing Kakuzu by what felt like the width of a hair, Naruto's Rasengan slammed into the earth, sending out a great wave of mud. Before Naruto could move out of the way, his face crumpled in pain as he felt a crushing force slam into his ribs, sending him flying backwards. Then even before he'd landed, Kakuzu was right in front of him again, moving as fast as he could. Naruto ducked low below his leg, and kicked out sideways in a leg sweep, but dodging that, Kakuzu jumped high into the air. Grimacing in pain, Naruto propelled himself after him with another crackle of lightning chakra, flashing into the air just above Kakuzu. With his teeth gritted, he concentrated on the ball of blue chakra materializing in his hand, determined to take advantage of his aerial position. The moonlight was just behind him, and in that instant Naruto could finally make out what Kakuzu looked like. Dressed in a large black cloak that was fluttering in the wind, the man's face was mostly covered, but Naruto could see a pair of green pupil-less eyes staring straight back at him. They widened, as Naruto's hand plunged straight for the man's heart. But in a smooth motion that seemed almost impossibly fast, Kakuzu's arm struck out at Naruto's hand, driving it outward so that it missed him, and with another turning kick that connected on his shoulder, sent him crashing down into the ground. With another grimace, Naruto managed to twist on his hands to lessen the impact, which still sent out even more waves of mud in every direction, separating him from Kakuzu. As they waited for the mud to settle, Naruto hastened to clamber to his feet. Seeing tiny stars circling around him, he swayed, and then almost jumped, as suddenly, a raucous sound, was that squawking? Filled the air. Naruto! He heard Mayu call out urgently. He turned and saw not only Kakuzu bearing down on him, but further back, what looked like a dense, dark cloud descending upon them. Immediately understanding her intention, he struggled to gather himself together, and then flashed away, dodging just in time Kakuzu's leg. Landing a safe distance away, Naruto saw the flock of shrieking birds set instead on Kakuzu, screeching and nipping at the ninja. Impatiently, the man batted at the bird, ripping it in two, but instantly, the parts recombined back into a whole bird once more. This time, Kakuzu kicked out widely, destroying almost half the flock, but again, the birds reformed, and continued to peck at him. Lowering his leg, Kakuzu made its king sound of impatience, seemingly deciding to ignore the birds for now. He instead returned his gaze back to Naruto. I didn't realize, Kakuzu growled, sounding as if he were talking to himself. Whereas he had only regarded Naruto with passing interest before, his concentration was now wholly on him. For some reason, his eyes seemed especially fixated on Naruto's hair. What is your purpose for attacking us here? Naruto called out, with a pant. Kakuzu took a step toward him, and his eyes narrowing, Naruto lowered himself into a defensive stance before continuing. You're an intelligent one, aren't you? Said Kakuzu, not sounding even the slightest bit winded. At least, more so than the last Jinchuriki we captured. Naruto froze. As if an eraser had wiped across the chalkboard of his mind, everything went blank. From a distance, he heard Mayu speak up, her voice tight with anxiety. Captured? What do you mean? Kakuzu opened his mouth as if to answer, and then suddenly, he stumbled. A look of fleeting surprise flashed across his face. What's this? Kakuzu held a hand up to his head, as if holding himself steady. A shadow of a bird's wing flashed across his face, and as he looked around at the birds, understanding filled his expression. Ah, the birds. My birds have poison on their beaks, Mayu said shakily. And once a sufficient amount reaches your heart, it'll stiffen the heart muscle until it becomes so hard, it completely stops pumping blood, rendering it useless. I see, said Kakuzu. His hand dropped to his side. He looked at Mayu, his strange eyes glinting. How fortunate for me, then, that I have multiple. Before Mayu could react, Kakuzu exploded forward. He ignored Naruto, and as if in slow motion, Naruto blankly watched Kakuzu go straight past him. His eyes trailed from the moving ninja to, just ahead, the target, a pale, shaking form with widened eyes. Where have I seen this before? The nostalgia of the scene, as if clubbing Naruto in the head, brought him back into his senses. Mayu! Naruto cried out. With a painful crackle, lightning chakra swept through his entire body, and he flung himself forward. Moving faster than he could ever remember moving before, Naruto got in front of Mayu, but before he could do anything else, Kakuzu's kick connected with his chest, making a terrible crushing sound. The force behind it was powerful enough to send the two of them flying into the air before careening into the muddy ground. With the wind knocked right out of him and his ribs screaming at him, he was fairly certain they were at the very least fractured, if not broken. It was all Naruto could manage to land on his 2 feet. To his relief, he heard Mayu land on her feet as well, with Naruto having taken most of the impact. It seemed that she was unharmed. He felt something warm trickle down his chin, and when he raised a hand to wipe it off, it came away red. Calmly, Kakuzu lowered his leg and looked straight at him. Panting, and with his teeth gritted, Naruto regarded the ninja. The way Kakuzu seemed to always be one step ahead of him and the way Naruto's attacks seemed to be a mere hindrance, rather than an actual threat, it was almost like fighting Kakashi. But in this case, a Kakashi who did not care at all for his well-being. One thing was for sure, Kakuzu was too strong for him. Naruto wiped away another trickle of blood from his mouth. What should I do? Clearly, fighting Kakuzu one-on-one the way he was now would only get both him and Mayu killed. Even fighting 2-on-1 was also out of the question, Mayu was a long-range support ninja, and one of her most offensive weapons, the flock of blue birds, seemed to have no real effect on Kakuzu. Their escape strategy had failed them, and their attempts at reasoning or bargaining with the man had gone nowhere. Worst of all, Kakuzu had talked about Jinchuriki as if he'd fought with one personally before, and as if he knew about what Naruto was. However, that didn't matter, at the moment. What mattered was that Naruto was going to be dead very soon if he couldn't figure out how to take on Kakuzu. But how? Kakuzu was stronger and faster than him. Naruto couldn't keep using his lightning chakra forever to dodge him, and he'd yet to even show his hand at jutsu. Kakuzu was completely out of his league, so how could Naruto defeat him? What did he have, that Kakuzu didn't have? That Kakashi didn't have? Naruto felt a cold bead of sweat drip down his temple. He recalled in his mind the words of a year ago, the words of a monster, "You've got guts, if anything." Very well then. Here is a gift for coming this far. His hands balled into fists by his side. He'd told himself that he was merely putting off talking to the beast because he was so busy, but the truth was, he'd never wanted to use its power. But now, what other choice did he have left? Letting out a deep breath, Naruto forced himself to relax. Closing his eyes and clearing his mind of everything else, he prepared to set foot once more in the long watery corridors of... What? He heard Kakuzu suddenly spoke up, and his eyes flew back open. Kakuzu had been silently regarding him, occasionally batting aside the birds that still continued to peck at him, but now, his head was tilted upward, as if talking to someone in the sky. After another long silence, Kakuzu bowed his head. Very well, then, as you wish. Kakuzu lowered his eyes to meet Naruto's shocked ones. I'll be back eventually. Prepare yourself. And then without another word, he disappeared. Chapter 22, Veritable Pandemonium. The ship's departure from the dock had been stalled for some time for an unknown reason, but finally, when both the sky and the ocean had become a deep inky black, it set off again. The lights from the cabins cast a reflective yellow glow across the sea, making it an easy mark for Kakashi to follow. Keeping watch from below the stern of the ship, it hadn't taken him much effort to identify the cabin Naruto and the others were in. Naruto must have passed by an uncovered porthole, for Kakashi had immediately noticed the flash of red. It's not like you to let down your guard, Naruto, even if you're returning from a completed mission, Kakashi chided silently. As the hours passed, the wind picked up and the lights in the cabins began to flicker off. Kakashi himself was starting to feel it in his shoulders. I'm getting old, aren't I? He thought amusedly to himself, and he'd been drenched in icy seawater more than once from straying too close to the ship. Finally, only when Kakashi had narrowly avoided being vomited on by some poor straggler at the deck of the ship, did he decide that it was time to actually get on board. Projecting a burst of chakra down to his legs, Kakashi shot himself up along the ship's side, landing silently in the shadowy silhouettes of a stack of wooden barrels. Looking around the empty deck, he made sure that the coast was clear. Though even if it weren't, he doubted he'd come across any real trouble. The ship had some hired guards, but they were at best genin-level ninja who could barely tell apart clones from the real thing. No, the hardest part about this would be hiding his presence from Naruto and the others. However, Naruto's cabin was all the way at the other side of the ship, and it was unlikely that any of them would venture out before dawn, by which time they'd already be at the border of Fire Country. The best course of action, he decided, would be for him to simply sit tight where he was, and then get off the ship before it docked at port. Suddenly, hearing footsteps, Kakashi shrunk further into the shadows, but it was just a stumbling, pale-faced cabin boy simultaneously swearing and hacking up what looked like the rest of his dinner over the railing. Nevertheless, Kakashi kept his eyes sharp and watched the boy, with a final utterance of a curse word, stumble back down through a hatchway. Kakashi wrinkled his nose. Some of the vomit must have splashed onto the deck, for he could quite clearly smell, along with the distinct odor of stomach acid, that dinner must have involved quite a few potatoes. What are you going to do to us? Grapefruit Breasts breathed in a high voice, her eyes flicking down repeatedly to the object he was twirling in his hand. Surely you don't think we'll crack from you tickling us with a feather, Bubble Butt scoffed. She'd recovered face relatively quickly despite being completely immobilized in his hair trap, but the underlying tension was still apparent. This will make excellent material for the next book I'm writing, said Jiraiya with a shake of the feather. It'll take some time, but you ladies aren't particularly pressed for it, I hope. We're not telling you anything. Bubblebutt spat at Jiraiya, but he made no move to avoid or clean it off. He sighed instead. For her own sake, he hoped she would. They were waiting where they had agreed to meet, by a massive oak tree near the edges of a forest along the far outreaches of Tajna's village. After everything they had already gone through, Naruto had braced himself for the worst, so when Rai and Sai's faces finally came into view, the relief he felt was so immense, he nearly stumbled on his landing. With Mayu helping to support him up, the two of them landed down just as the sun was starting to rise, spreading its tendrils almost shyly through the cracks of the canopy trees. Mayu! Naruto! Rai called out to them, relief spreading across in his face. Leaving Sai behind, he began to run toward them. You're ALRI, whoa, Naruto. Rai hesitantly came to a stop in front of them, his eyes raking up and down Naruto's bloodied form. I'm fine, they're just flesh wounds, said Naruto, deciding not to mention the pain in his ribs. The pain had already ebbed away to a minor throbbing in his chest. Sitting down, he tipped his head back and allowed himself to lean back against the tree trunk. Kakuzu found us, Mayu said shakily, her arms crisscrossing across her chest. Rai's eyes widened. You too? What do you mean? Naruto frowned, quickly turning toward the other boy. Were you caught too? Yeah, that other one, he got to us, Rai confirmed with a troubled look on his face. Then, apparently noticing Mayu's expression, he hastened to add, but nothing happened. He was just spewing a lot of crap, and then he suddenly started talking to the air, before leaving. That's essentially what happened with us, said Mayu. Except Kakuzu didn't talk so much. Rai's face noticeably grew in pallor, and this time, it was her turn to add, don't worry, I'm alright. It was Naruto who fended him off right until he suddenly left. As some of the color returned to his face, Rai let out a whistle. Didn't Sai say he was an S rank? And you managed to hold him off. Naruto didn't say anything, but clenched his hands tightly. He looked down at the ground, unable to meet his teammates' eyes. It had been his plan to split up the team and send off decoys, but it hadn't worked. His decisions had placed all of his teammates in danger, and it could only be called a miracle that they were all there alive. Naruto, he heard Mayu start, but she was cut off as suddenly. Rai punched him on the shoulder so strongly, he could have sworn he'd heard another rib crack. Naruto's head snapped up to see Rai looking down at him exasperatedly. Oh come on now, enough with the gloom, said Rai. Two insanely powerful lunatics were after us, but the three, well, four I suppose, of us are all here in one piece, relatively unharmed. What more could you ask for? Naruto paused. Sorry, he finally said, his hands uncurling at his sides. Rai was right, this was no time to be wallowing in regret. And if it was any consolation, despite Kakuzu's comment about Jinchuriki, Mayu seemed to be none the wiser. Anyways, Rai said, waving away his apology with a dismissive air. We did get something out of that Hidan guy. Turns out they weren't just a random pair of criminals walking around in the middle of nowhere. They're involved with whatever's going down in Wave Country right now. Mayu's hand leapt up to her open mouth. You mean with Gato? There's going to be an event of some sort in 3 days, Sai finally spoke up. It seemed the incident with Hidan had gotten to him, he seemed unusually on edge. Someone important will be in the city. Rai shrugged. Well, that's the basic digest of what we thought Hidan was saying anyways. It's probably got nothing to do with us, but... Naruto got to his feet. But first things first, we need to get back. We'll decide what to do after we've gotten back in touch with Shirakumo and the others. However, forced to take multiple detours and roundabouts to throw off any possible trackers, it was several more hours before Naruto and the others finally reached Tajna's home. Ushered through the door by a worried-looking Tsunami, the starving four were promptly seated at the table with platters stacked high with, as one could have guessed it, fish and rice. Once they had managed to get out the full story of what had happened, the involved adults stood around with troubled expressions on their faces while Naruto and his teammates stuffed their faces. An event in the harbor city in which someone important will be in danger. Tsunami murmured uneasily. There's only one thing that could be, said Kane flatly. Tajna sighed. The ceremony. The ceremony? What's that? Menma cocked his head curiously. You've got a piece of rice stuck on your face by the way, he pointed out to Rai, who ignored him. The daimyo and his children will be paraded through the city in a charade of well-being, with the stated purpose of reassuring the citizens that they are doing just fine, Kane spat. But basically, one of Geto's ways of appeasing the other nations by telling them that he's not trying to overthrow the system. And at the same time, reminding everyone in the country who's really in control, Shirakumo murmured, his brow furrowed in thought. So is the daimyo going to be assassinated then? Tajna asked in a heavy voice. It depends on whether those two you described, Hidan and Kakuzu, was it? Work for Geto or not, Kane said. But regardless, this doesn't change anything. Risks like this have already been accounted for in my plans. Naruto put his chopsticks down, and looked at Kane. Plans. The others had also stopped eating, though Rai continued to chew on some seaweed, as they waited for the gorilla merchant to answer. She looked around at them seriously, her freckles in stark contrast with the morning lighting. I've already forced you all to overextend your stay for the affairs of a country that have nothing to do with you, she said, with a slight bow of her head. And I am truly sorry for that. But that ceremony in 3 days is when all my plans come to a head. After that ceremony is over, whether the mission has succeeded or failed, I will ensure with all my power that you are all properly compensated and relieved from your obligations here. And this mission will involve. Shirakumo crossed his arms across his chest. Kane smiled grimly, and looked directly at Naruto. How good are you all at behaving like actual, normal children? Hirumo whistled as he looked around at the messy scene. This is brutal, Jiraiya-sama. His nose wrinkled. Is that something burning I smell? Hirumo was one of his trusted sources in Wave Country, and their mutually beneficial relationship had a long history spanning the many years Jiraiya had spent building up his spy network. The short ponytailed ninja's best characteristic was, in Jiraiya's opinion, the way he showed up promptly and without any unnecessary questions as soon as he was called for. He was, if anything, efficient and experienced in covering his tracks, making the chance of his being caught and spilling details of their alliance rather minuscule indeed. Jiraiya sighed heavily. If only they'd break sooner. He made no move to wipe his face, which was speckled with tiny flecks of dark blood. It would have been better for them. I assume you got the information you wanted. Some. The one who actually knew anything didn't break quite so easily. Squatting down, Hirumo opened the mouth of one of the bodies, peering inside it with the air of looking at an interesting museum specimen. You had preventative measures to stop her from biting her tongue or ingesting any sort of poison, I gather. Yes, Jiraiya said simply. He chose not to mention how he'd chosen to end her life as soon as he realized that he'd gotten everything he'd ever get out of her. A loyal one, she'd been. She was working for Zabuza, who is in turn, working for Geto. Hirumo nodded in confirmation. Yes, I've heard multiple reports about Zabuza being spotted as a bodyguard for Geto. He's not exactly a difficult man to miss. But is that it? She didn't seem to understand the significance behind a certain word they were using as a code name for suspicious individuals such as myself, but perhaps you could shed some light on their connection to them. This certain word being. Hirumo said curiously. Akatsuki. Akatsuki. Hirumo repeated slowly, tasting the word with his tongue. His eyes had lit up like a child that had just caught sight of a favorite toy he had put aside at one point, and then forgotten about its existence. I'd heard rumors but dismissed them. Rumors about? Jiraiya prodded him. About a growing organization that was supporting Geto from the shadows, or even controlling, perhaps, Hirumo said. Then with a thoughtful look, he added, there's been a confirmed recent sighting of Kakuzu at one of the bounty stations along the coastline. Jiraiya folded his arms across his chest, processing the information. Kakuzu was one of the more frequently spotted members of Akatsuki, showing up from time to turn in a ridiculous amount of bounties in exchange for money. However, there was nothing Jiraiya could do about that, bounty stations were strictly black market, and while information regarding Kakuzu's visits could be bought at a price, his visits were indiscriminate and without pattern, making them impossible to track. Hirumo got up, wiping his hands clean on the sides of his pants. Was that it, Jiraiya-sama? There was one final thing I got out of the interrogation, Jiraiya said distractedly. They were supposed to report back to Zabuza at some sort of big event soon, in the harbor city. Do you know anything about that? That'll be the daimyo's ceremony for sure, said Hirumo without any hesitation. Ceremony? Out of the way, kid. In the fat man's hurry to get to the front of the crowd, he reached out with an impatient hand to shove the small boy to the side, but to his surprise, it swiped uselessly through the air. The man glanced down and then did a double take, finding nothing there. He looked around, but there were at least a dozen other children of the same size and coloring in the immediate vicinity. The boy could have been any one of them. So, with little more than a fleeting wondering thought, the man moved on. Meanwhile, through bright blue eyes, Naruto watched the man disappear into the crowd before effortlessly merging into it once more. As he began to be jostled forward by the mass, he looked around at the numbers calculatingly. It seemed that a substantial number of people had gathered at the city for the ceremony, for he had never seen even half that number of people during the busiest hours of the city. And while most of them looked like civilians, there were some who stood out like a sore thumb, namely those with weapons. Most were subtle, with daggers strapped to their thighs, but here and there were the obvious ones with bulky swords and katana on their backs. Those kinds of people walked about with a bubble around them, as the civilians avoided eye contact and gave them a wide berth. A flashing motion caught Naruto's eye, and he turned to see a scruffy-looking boy with dark coloring nod at him before ducking and disappearing into the crowd, Rai. As he looked around, several more caught his eye, a sour-faced girl with short hair, a scratched-up boy with cropped black hair, Sakura. Menma. He couldn't spot Mayu, Sai, or Sasuke, but that was because they were situated on the other side of the venue, a winding path that led from the daimyo's ceremonial estate to the city's center. They were all arranged strategically near the front of the crowd, along with most of the other civilian children. It was a custom in Wave Country for the daimyo's procession to hand out ryo and candy to the watching children, and as Naruto looked around at the many orphans crowding around him, it was apparent that most of them had made the pilgrimage here for that very purpose. Is this why Kane-san took it as well as she did, when she found out we were her escorts? Naruto wondered. Henge, the transformation jutsu, was an E-rank jutsu, but it was difficult to maintain perfectly while under high external strain. And the closer your transformation was to your real appearance, the easier it was to maintain it. For example, it would be easier for an adult male to transform into another adult male than into a young boy, and vice versa. Once Naruto and Sasuke's teams had transformed into typical hungry-eyed children, melting into the background became effortless. This was key for the mission Kane had proposed to them 3 days earlier in Tajna's house, to rescue the daimyo's 2 children, the prince and princess, so that Gato couldn't use them as a means of controlling the daimyo anymore. According to Kane, rescuing the daimyo himself would be too risky. Not only would he be the most heavily guarded, but it would only give Gato a reason to seize the vacuum of authority left behind in the daimyo's absence, no matter how temporary. Suddenly, there was a flurry of motion and then hushed whispering. The moving crowd came to a stop, all of the heads facing one direction, and there, at the far end of the pathway, Naruto could see what looked like the beginnings of a procession making its way through. At the back was a series of ornately decorated sedan chairs, from which Naruto could make out smiling faces and waving hands, the daimyo and his children. And standing around them was an array of women and men with kunai and swords glinting nakedly on their persons. Naruto quickly did a head count and saw that Kane's information had been on spot. The sedan chair holding the princess and prince was relatively lightly guarded with 3 bodyguards, not including the carriers. If Kane's information could be further counted on, there were a few more guards scattered in the crowd disguised as civilians, but if their plan worked out, they shouldn't have time to matter. The daimyo's sedan chair, on the other hand, was surrounded by no less than 7 guards, most prominently of which was a pale-skinned man with bandages running across the lower half of his face, and a gigantic broadsword on his back. Without fail, wherever he passed through the crowd, a visible wave of fear swept through it. "That's Zabuza," a passing voice hissed tightly in his ear. Menma, and Naruto nodded. So this was the infamous missing nin. He'd thought that Menma's team had finished him off, but this was no time to question things. Either Zabuza had survived or someone was impersonating him. Whatever the case, he was another powerful obstacle they would have to get through to complete the mission. Naruto felt an uneasy shiver go down his spine. It was strange, however, that a missing nin could be so boldly parading in front of thousands of people like that. No matter how powerful he was basically painting a target on himself for any of his village's hunter nin. As he waited for the signal, Naruto watched the procession get closer and closer to where he was standing. Every now and then, a hand, full of something that glinted brightly in the afternoon sun, popped out of one of the sedan chairs, and every time, as if a dam had broken, the children surged forward. There seemed to be some invisible rule in place that prevented adults from joining in. When a few stragglers moved forward to do so, they were promptly knocked out by the children around them. If they were lucky, their unconscious bodies were dragged out to the edge of the crowd. Just as the first sedan chair began to pass by where Naruto was waiting, the hand popped out once more, and this time, he could see that it was attached to a young-looking girl dressed richly in pale robes. She looked cheerful, likely she was too young to understand the precarious hostage situation her family and country was in. The children around Naruto surged forward, and he joined in half-heartedly. He reached up in the air with a hand, and in that instant, met the princess' gaze. Her eyes were blue, like his. Taken aback, he held his breath, and then with a bright smile, she tossed the coins in her hand toward him. Before they reached him, however, several of the larger and rougher orphans knocked his hand aside and leaped up to swipe the coins. Naruto saw another orphan boy aiming a kick at his chest. Easily dodging it, he nevertheless pretended to have been hurt and fell backward in the crowd, intending to disappear and lose whatever the small attention he'd unintentionally gathered. But before Naruto hit the ground, a strong hand grabbed his shoulder and pulled him up. He looked up to see a tall man with long shaggy white hair, and immediately recognized him as the man he'd chanced upon in the bathhouse a week ago. "Are you all right?" said the man, and Naruto mutely nodded, his mind whirring with several possibilities. Was this other man working for Geto? Had he found out about the plot, and seen through Naruto's disguise? But before Naruto could do anything else, the man simply said, "Be more careful from now on," and then walked away. Naruto stood still, unsure of how to react, and as if answering him, a roaring sound filled his ears. Naruto's head snapped toward the procession's path just in time to see three massive black and white tigers leaping at Zabuza, the signal. The crowd had been stunned into silence, but as the missing nin pulled his sword off his back with an accompanying flash of steel, they were galvanized into action. Screaming, people, children and adults alike, began scrambling away from the path. The same orphan boy who had tried to kick Naruto before came running at him with a panicked expression on his face. Leaping forward, Naruto jumped past him, heading straight for the procession. Naruto landed on the path, with Rai, Sakura, and Menma right behind him. All of the guards were distracted, focusing their attention on the other side of the path, where now, on top of size beast drawings, a flock of birds as well as several fast-moving bodies were wreaking havoc. Naruto pulled the tanto from his back and in the same smooth action, burst forward to the princess and prince's sedan chair. The main guard, a tall disciplined-looking woman with hair tightly pulled back in a bun, noticed him, and as she raised her blade toward him, her mouth opened to shout a warning. But before she could make a sound, Naruto was past her. With a spray of bright red blood, the body fell to the ground and her head rolled away on the ground. When Naruto glanced behind to check, he saw that Rai had similarly taken care of the other guard, while Menma and Sakura knocked out the third. Menma and Sakura looked at them with stunned expressions on their faces, but paying no mind, Naruto reached into the sedan chair. The prince and princess, looking terrified, had backed away to the other side. Noticing that their eyes were fixated on the blood dripping from his tanto, Naruto hastily returned it to its sheath. Then, he grabbed the arm of the princess, Rai grabbed the prince, and pulled her trembling figure out. She began to struggle in his hands, but she was weak, even for a civilian. "What are you doing?" the princess cried out. "Stop. We're here to save you," said Naruto quietly. He shot a look toward the daimyo's sedan. Though Zabuza's back was toward them, one of the guards had noticed them and had started to move toward them with a sword in his hand. "We don't have time. Come quietly, or I'll knock you out." Growing still, the princess' eyes became as round as the coins she'd been tossing out, and taking advantage of it, Naruto tossed her over his shoulder and jumped out of the chair. Just as he prepared to leap down into the crowd, there was a scream. "Rai!" Naruto turned to see Rai duck just in time to dodge a long sword. Rai backed away protectively in front of the prince as the guard thrust the sword again at him. Naruto's hand immediately went down to the kunai on his thigh holster, but before he could throw it, there was a flash of blue and then the guard was yelping, swiping at the air around his face with his hands. "Mayu!" Rai yelled out, relieved. "I'm okay. Go help the others." Mayu, pale-faced, nodded. Menma tackled the guard she'd been distracting, and she ran off, her birds flocking around above her head. To Naruto's relief, Zabuza seemed to be completely ignoring them, focusing his attention instead on the Jonin weaving in and out to attack him, Shirakumo. Naruto and Rai jumped down into the crowd, the princess and prince collectively in their arms, and began to run swiftly past the shocked faces of the civilians. As they ran through the mayhem, one guard managed to get past Menma and Sakura, but Naruto quickly disposed of him with a flick of a kunai. After that, with a cursory look around, Naruto confirmed that there was no one else coming after them. "Send the signal," Naruto said shortly. Rai nodded, and brought his hands together in the snake hand seal. Immediately, there was a distant exploding sound. On the other side of the gigantic crowd, a billowing black cloud of smoke rose into the air, a planted harmless letter bomb that signaled that Naruto and Rai had successfully retrieved the prince and princess, and that the others should retreat. "Be safe, everyone," Naruto thought to himself, his teeth gritted and his heart pounding loudly in his ears. With a long history of battle with fate, Jiraiya had set foot in the harbor city that morning, steeling himself for whatever the day's events should throw at him. However, what was unfolding before his eyes had even his mouth dropping wide open. It was utter chaos. Any semblance of order had dissipated as soon as the missing nin from Mist drew his sword. Civilians were screaming and scrambling to distance themselves, while a scattered few in the crowd were drawing hidden blades and struggling to reach the procession. From what Jiraiya had been able to see, it looked as though a group of ninja had attacked the guards standing around the daimyo's sedan chair. While the guards were distracted, a group of 4 civilian children swooped onto the sedan chair in front. It was at this point that Jiraiya realized they probably weren't as innocent as they looked, and pulled out a pair of children, before running off with them. Jiraiya was now in a quandary. Should he interfere? And if so, which side? The supposed kidnappers, or those who had been keeping the daimyo hostage? His gut was tugging him in the direction of the daimyo's sedan chair. As a cloud of black smoke suddenly burst beside him, the level of screaming around him elevated to even higher heights, but Jiraiya could tell it was harmless. He decided to trust it. It was, after all, what had kept him alive all these years. Leaping strongly into the air, Jiraiya headed directly for the daimyo's sedan chair, and as he did so, immediately, he could tell that something was off. The smoke must have been a signal for them to retreat, for the various ninja that had been attacking were now trying to flee. But even as he watched, the one named Zabuza knocked out a black-haired boy with a swing of his blade and then reached out to grab a thin woman, who slumped in his grasp. There were 2 cloaked figures beside him, one holding an older man and a struggling young girl in each hand, the other exchanging blows with what appeared to be a shinobi wearing the leaf Hitai. Now that Jiraiya was close enough to see, he knew immediately who he was facing. The masked one was Kakuzu. The other one was not a familiar face to Jiraiya, but judging from his black cloak, was a member of Akatsuki as well. Jiraiya-sama. The shinobi, who Jiraiya suddenly recognized as one of the Leaf's Jonin, cried out. "Is that really you?" Leaning forward, Jiraiya thrust out his hand and struck a pose. "Yes, it is I. Jiraiya, the great toad sage and best-selling author of Icha-Icha." Zabuza turned toward him. "So you're one of the legendary Sunin, Jiraiya." He released the woman he'd been holding. Falling to the ground, she scampered away. The man beside Kakuzu looked interested. "A Sunin. As much as I'd like to get the bounty on your head, Sunin," said Kakuzu. "I have no interest in fighting you today. Some other time, perhaps." He jerked his head at the other man, who scowled widely. Zabuza stepped back to the sedan chair to grab a frightened-looking man in fancy robes. "Some other time, you say?" said Jiraiya. "That'll be difficult, seeing as how you'll be dead." Chapter 23, Raising the Curtain. For what felt like the 100th time that day, a distant explosion rocked the ground. The walls of the building shook, and dust from the ceiling trickled down around them. There was a dull clamor in the distance that could have been the sounds of screaming, but she tried not to think of it. Princess Awano of the Land of Waves did not understand what was happening to them. Just that morning, she had finally been allowed to see her old nursemaid, and she had been dressed in fine silk robes that felt unbearably soft after months of wearing nothing but rough smocks. The small man in black glasses had been there. He'd appeared in her doorway with the 2 bodyguards who never left his side. And then he'd promised her that if she or her little brother ever stopped smiling on that day's procession, he would rip off all of their fingernails. Awano believed him. The last time the small man had made them a promise, her mother had disappeared. And she'd tried her best. Every time Hakyu looked like he was about to cry, she'd squeezed his hand and stretched her own smile even wider. But even though she'd never stopped smiling, their guards had all been killed in front of them, heads and bodies falling unnaturally away from each other. Amidst explosions and shouting, they'd been dragged from their chairs and carried away. Now, they were hiding in an empty building by the waterside. Hakyu shook in her arms, and Awano drew him in closer to her thudding chest, but she dared not scream. After all, the 2 who had kidnapped and brought them here were right in front of them. The one with a scar on his face silently paced back and forth, gripping what looked like a knife in each hand. In sharp contrast, the other, with bright red hair, the one who had taken Awano, was pressed up against the wall by the door, stock still. They had been hiding in the masses of children that had swarmed her sedan chair, but they must have been working for the man in black glasses. And now, they were just waiting for the signal to kill. Awano looked down at her brother, and smiled at him. Maybe she just hadn't been smiling enough. Maybe if she kept smiling, she thought, the small man in black glasses would change his mind. Suddenly, the boy who had been pacing stopped, and at the same time, Awano thought her heart would burst. Someone's coming. As far as Naruto was aware, everything had gone pretty much according to plan except for the final and most important part, that everyone regroup at the safe house Kane had managed to procure. Well, he and Rai were there with the prince and princess, but the absence of the others who should have been back by now was painfully apparent. If the plan hadn't stressed the importance of sticking to their individual parts, Naruto would have already left by now in search of his remaining teammates. As it was, he had to force himself still, and lacking the means of any meaningful communication, the most he could do was to keep his senses sharp for the slightest sound of approach. Thankfully, he wasn't kept waiting for too long. The first to arrive was Kane. She came alone, shivering from either cold or adrenaline. As soon as the door opened, the merchant woman froze and stared at Naruto. She looked lost, as though she hadn't been the one to outline the entire plan in the first place, before a look of relief filled her face. Stepping into the building, however, some of the relief began to visibly fade. "Where is everyone else?" Naruto cleared his throat. "You're the first one to make it back." And hopefully, he added to himself, she wouldn't be the last. "You didn't see the others? Did you see Mayu?" Rai prompted, his tone worried. Kane shook her head. "It's chaos out there. We all got separated. I barely got away myself. I'll get into the details once the others get here." His jaw setting, Rai didn't respond. Instead, with an extra crease lining his furrowed brow, he resumed his pacing. Meanwhile, Naruto returned to his position by the doorway, his head spinning with possibilities. It had always been a risk of the plan that some of them wouldn't make it back to the safe house. In fact, it was a risk that had always been there from the start. It was an integral part of their job description. Naruto was well aware, and had assumed the responsibility that came with it as soon as he'd accepted the mission. And yet, there was something very wrong with their current situation. Something had felt off from the moment his team had arrived in Wave Country. Had it been mere coincidence that he had met Hidan again? That Hidan had been with someone who knew about Jinchuriki? And who in the world was that white-haired man he'd met at the bathhouse and again at the procession? It was as though he held several puzzle pieces in his hand, with no idea of where the rest of the puzzle was, or whether they all even belonged to the same puzzle. A frustrating thought, understanding how little he knew, yet lacking the capability to learn more. It was then, with his thoughts being thrown about like leaves in the wind, that Naruto caught sight of the princess' face, and it gave him pause. Was it because Kane was an adult, unlike he and Rai? With every step Kane took towards the two children, Naruto thought he could see the color drain from the princess' face. The princess' mouth opened, and he thought she would speak. Suddenly, his attention snapped up towards the ceiling. There was an open crack there that led to the outside, and something had just slipped inside a bird. For an instant, hope welled up in his chest, but it was quashed just as quickly. It was a small bird made of ink, not a bluebird, and it flew down straight into his hands. "It's from Sai," Naruto announced, reading the contents off a scroll. "He and two others are on their way." As if right on cue, the door slammed open, and Sakura and Menma staggered inside. Looking slightly less bedraggled, Sai followed them. As the three collected their breaths, there was a pregnant pause. And then, "Where's Mayu?" Rai blurted out. "I'm fine, thanks," said Sai, but for once, the smile was gone from his face. He looked around at the building's occupants, and his gaze fixed on Kane. Something there hardened. Before anyone else could say anything, Sai made his move. And somehow, Naruto knew what he was going to do. In a flash of movement, there was a screeching sound as Sai's kunai met Naruto's, an inch from Kane's exposed neck. "Some other time you say, that'll be difficult, seeing as how you'll be dead." Even before the last few words had left his lips, Jiraiya began to move, joining his hands together in the snake seal, Ranjishigami no Jutsu, Wild Lion's main technique. His chakra coursing through his hair, it burst out into what looked like gigantic white ropes that surged through the air, flying straight towards his opponents. In an impressive range of diversity, the men immediately splintered into three different responses. With the two bodies still in his hold, Kakuzu deftly leaped into the air, evading his attack. Zabuza on the other hand released the man he had been holding and stood his ground, countering his technique with an oversized sword. Meanwhile, with seemingly little regard for his own demise, the other member of Akatsuki shot straight towards Jiraiya, a maniacal expression stretched across his face and a flashy scythe in hand. Scooping Zabuza's cargo, a man who could only have been the country's daimyo, out of harm's way with one rope of his hair, Jiraiya felt his lungs swelling up with chakra and reared back. Katon, Ryukan no Jutsu, Fire Style, Dragon Flame Jutsu. Sheer heat searing his face, he blew out a stream of fire that roared along the ropes of his hair toward his opponents. In an instant, the one who had been making a beeline for Jiraiya was consumed in the fire, and the smell of burning flesh filled his nostrils. On the other side of the battlefield, Zabuza raised his sword and sliced the air with a gigantic swing, countering the stream of fire headed in his direction. However, it was all he could do to raise it just in time to parry another sword, this time, from Shirakumo. Jiraiya returned his attention towards the man who was now a burning inferno before him. It was curious, by all standards, he should have been reduced to nothing but melted flesh and charred bone by now, but even as he could begin to make out hints of pure white bone in the man's face, the man kept walking toward him. His lips had burned off, but the bared teeth made it look as though he was grinning. No, the madman was actually laughing, the sound raising goosebumps along Jiraiya's arms. In a single creaking motion, the burning skeletal frame raised its scythe. Since evading Jiraiya's first attack, Kakuzu had made no move from the peripheries to help his allies, but he spoke now, in guttural tones, "Zabuza." It must have been a warning. Thrusting his sword forward to force Shirakumo back, the missing nin held up his free hand in a telltale sign. Thick, immovable mist converged on the grounds, fogging his senses. "I will claim the bounty on your head, eventually." Kakuzu's disembodied voice rang out harshly. "But for now, you are not our target." And then they were gone. For a moment, Jiraiya debated the merits of entering Sage Mode, as distasteful as its appearance was in giving chase, but dismissed it. There was a storm brewing in the horizon, and he had not survived on his own after all these years by remaining his younger, brash self. What he needed at this juncture was patience, and more information on who exactly he was facing. A body soon approached Jiraiya. It was Shirakumo. Drawing closer, he saw that the Jonin was supporting on each arm the body of the daimyo and another boy. One of his students, perhaps. Shirakumo's voice was heavy. "Jiraiya-sama." They've taken 2 of ours. Jiraiya solemnly surveyed what he could of their surroundings. Most of the civilians in the vicinity had managed to escape before the confrontation, but there were casualties scattered here and there, hidden in the fog. While the intel he had received from Hirumo had led him here, he'd found no answers, only more questions. Such as, why were 2 members of Akatsuki here? Having tracked their movements over the years, Jiraiya had found that they tended to work in pairs when hunting down particularly strong bounties or important targets. What was of such importance here in Wave Country that warranted the presence of not only 2 Akatsuki members, but an S-rank missing nin such as Zabuza? It was a gut feeling, but Jiraiya suspected that there was something more at stake here than Gato's tyranny of a small island nation. In a flash, he made up his mind. Take me to the others you were with. You owe me an explanation or two. The sun was up, the ship had docked in Fire Country, and the remaining passengers were disembarking. The million Ryo question for Kakashi was, where was his team, +1? He spotted a straggler getting off the ship, swaying side to side down the ramp. It was the cabin boy he'd seen earlier, who'd been sacrificing the contents of his stomach all night. Excuse me, Kakashi called out cheerily. I've been expecting the arrival of fortune in today from Wave Country. 3 males and 1 female, on the young side. Do you know where they are? To his surprise, the cabin boy scowled. Those thieves were ninja? Never got back on board, did they? Kakashi blinked. Excuse me. They remained locked in their positions, their blades grinding into the others in a slow fall towards an impending assault. Sai's eyes had never looked so cold. Do get out of my way, before I kill the both of you. Naruto could tell it wasn't an idle threat, but he didn't move. Explain yourself. Meanwhile, with a hand reaching into his shuriken holster, Rai turned furiously towards Sai. What are you doing? Get away from them. Sai's gaze flickered to his teammate, and Naruto could see the calculations going through his mind. He tensed, readying himself for battle, but after a long, drawn-out moment, Sai lowered his blade. How do you think she got away from that battle? The question hung in the air, and Naruto turned to Kane. Despite the near attempt on her life, she was oddly composed. There was a resigned, almost relieved, look on her face, and with a lurching realization, it told him everything he needed to know. How did you figure it out? Said the woman. I'd had my suspicions, your choice of cargo. The attack in the boat. The way your plans separated us. And they were all confirmed the moment I saw Zabuza let you go. In 2 rigid motions, Kane bobbed her head in acknowledgement. You weren't supposed to see that. I don't think you were supposed to survive. A slow, creeping sensation began to rise up in Naruto's chest. Wait, what's going on? Said Rai, wearing an expression as though he had just been clubbed. What are you talking about? It doesn't matter anymore, Kane shrugged with the weariness of defeat, and raised her bare hands in surrender. Do what you will with me. Sai cocked his head, raising an eyebrow at Naruto in a silent question. Naruto could have asked many questions of the woman standing before him, but only one rose unbidden to his lips. Who are you really working for? Her lips drew back in bitter relish, as though she had been waiting to hear that question her whole life. Akatsuki. When Mayu came to her senses, she was no longer fighting for her life in the iron grasp of the cloaked missing nin. Instead, judging from the stiff material binding her arms to her sides and the stale feeling of air on her face, she was tied up on the ground somewhere indoors. Despite the rising sensation of panic in her stomach and the heat of bile in her throat, she forced herself to continue breathing at a slow, even pace. Next, taking great care, millimeter by millimeter, she opened her eyes a slit. Almost immediately, she wished she hadn't, for she was alone in a dimly lit cave. The foreboding sensation of being enclosed enveloped her, and the unease permeating her body intensified. Will he come for you, I wonder? A high voice rang out. A spike of chill ran down her spine, and Mayu's eyes flew all the way open. She struggled to flip onto her feet, but an inexplicable and absolute force kept her immobile in place, and the only thing she could do in that moment was to take in the sight which, contrary to her thoughts, stood before her. She was not alone. There was a man standing at the entrance of the cave. He wore the same black cloak the other missing nin had been wearing, and an swirling orange mask hid his features from her. The Nine Tails Jinchuriki, Uzumaki Naruto. What do you think about him? Chapter 24, Hidden Will to Fight. It had been years since Jiraiya had last returned to Konoha, and in his absence, Naruto had grown up. Taking a good look at him, the boy's resemblance to his father was astonishing. If it wasn't for the flaming red hair he'd so clearly inherited from his mother, Jiraiya would have thought it was his old student brought back from the dead. What's going on here? Shirakumo demanded, looking back and forth. Unfortunately, this was perhaps not the best time for a reunion between godfather and godson. The safe house Shirakumo had promised looked to have been compromised. With a single sweeping glance, Jiraiya assessed the situation. Naruto, along with 3 other Leaf Chunin, surrounded a bound female civilian in what could only be an interrogation. Beyond them, a young female genin comforted 2 civilian children cowering in the corner. She betrayed us, said the blonde Chunin, his nostrils flared. We stayed here to help her and she freaking betrayed us. An angry-looking Chunin rounded on Shirakumo. Where the hell is Mayu? Why is she not with you? The Jonin shook his head. I'm sorry. She and Tajna were both taken. We don't know where, but we decided to first regroup to reassess the situation. Letting out a swear, the Chunin reached down and grabbed the bound woman by the scruff of her shirt. Where is she? Where did they take her? To her credit, the bound woman looked calm. I don't know. What do you mean you don't? Who are you? Naruto broke in. It was directed towards Jiraiya. The boy's gaze had been fixed on him from the moment they had reached the safe house. Jiraiya felt intrigue bubbling inside of him. With Naruto looking this similar physically to Minato, he had to wonder whether he took after him in other aspects as well. Thrusting out a hand, he struck a pose for the second time that day. Thank you for asking. I am Mount Myaboku's monk of the Frog Spirits, also known as the Toad Sage, Jiraiya. Jiraiya. Naruto had heard the name before. There had been numerous records of the Sunin's legendary deeds from the Second World War. If he remembered correctly, the Hokage had once mentioned the name as well, in association with his father. In all the legends of the Sunin, however, none had mentioned a perverted old man who peeked in the women's baths. Naruto glanced at Shirakumo, but the Jonin's demeanor seemed unfazed around the man. Nor did he look as though he was being controlled by some sort of genjutsu. Was this man truly who he claimed to be the great sage, Jiraiya? Could they count this strange man as a potential ally? It may have been a comforting thought, especially in the light of recent events. But whereas he could see Team Shirakumo's members relaxing, Naruto did not jump to the happy possibility. Instead, he maintained his distance. He would choose his own allies, he thought. Does Akatsuki mean anything to you too? Naruto asked. As expected, Shirakumo shook his head, but Jiraiya looked intrigued. Is this civilian involved in Akatsuki? What is Akatsuki? Naruto pressed. Jiraiya stroked his chin. They're an organization I've been tracking for years now. For all intents and purposes, they function like mercenaries, taking on all sorts of nasty, shady missions the villages don't want to be associated with. But as for their final objective, well, that's why I'm still out in the field. Let me say this, at least. It was Kane, her chin jutting out stiffly. The true reason why Gato has been able to stay in power is because Akatsuki has been supporting him from the shadows. Then how could you be working for them? Rai exploded. I thought you wanted to help this country. They made me a deal. I was to go into the Hidden Leaf, request Chunin bodyguards on a journey to Wave Country, and delay their return for as long as possible. In turn, they would withdraw their support for Gato, allowing us to overthrow him and take back the daimyo. Kane's voice grew quiet. And of course, they reminded me of the consequences of failure. Naruto's thoughts flashed back to their journey across the water, on the mysterious assassination attempt on the merchant. Sai's eyes narrowed. You sure are speaking freely. Why is that? Even if you all kill me now, I've carried out my end of the deal. This country will soon be free. Gato will be dead, and my brother's death won't have been in vain. A mixture of both resignation and pride struggled for dominance on Kane's face. There's no longer any reason for me to hide the truth. As I said, Do what you will with me. I'm prepared for the consequences. But why? Menma spoke up. Why would this Akatsuki group want to keep some random leafnin here in Wave Country? Perhaps it wasn't so random, said Jiraiya, staring straight at Naruto. One by one, the pieces were coming together. Judging by the glimmer of realization in Shirakumo's eyes and the puzzled looks on his teammates' faces, everyone his own age had been kept in the dark regarding Naruto. He felt a stab of irritation. Considering how the Hokage had gone out of his way to even put a seal on his memories, he'd thought the old man would have at least done a better job of keeping him a village secret. But now it seemed as though he was on the hit list of every other missing nin out there. They're capturing Jinchuriki, he said at last. And they're here for me. The Nine-Tails Jinchuriki, Uzumaki Naruto. What do you think about him? Before she could stop herself, Mayu felt her eyes widen. How did this man know about Naruto? But no, she couldn't reveal that she understood his question. I don't know who you're talking about, she said, bracing herself for the man's reaction. Instead, he seemed to take it in stride. Well, of course you do. He's your teammate, and current team leader. From his similar attire and the way the man freely walked about the cave, it was clear that he was associated with the missing nin who had captured her. However, that was the only thing he seemed to have in common with them. He didn't inspire overwhelming terror in the way those two did. He was just weird. As discreetly as she could, Mayu scanned their vicinity. Apart from the man, they were alone. She felt her heart lift. While she had been disarmed and bound with rope, she could still feel the clips in her hair. In a voice that sounded stronger than she felt, she demanded, "What do you want from me? I'm not important enough to my village to ransom with, and no one's going to come here for me." Suddenly, with a pang, she thought of Rai. With any luck, Naruto would be able to hold him back from making any rash moves. "Oh ho. So he's trash," said the man in a cheery voice. Despite herself, Mayu frowned. "That's not what I said. What kind of team leader wouldn't come to rescue his team member?" She hesitated. "The mission is more important than the individual. Naruto won't come to rescue me." The force that had previously kept her frozen in place was gone, and she struggled up to her feet. "Because I don't need him to." For some reason, that seemed to greatly amuse the man, who broke out into a laugh and began to spin around. "You think so? Kakuzu-san's keeping you here as bait, you know. But if they're not coming for you, why are we even keeping you here, then?" Mayu started to try and wriggle a hand free. If she could just make the sign, she'd be able to release her bluebirds. "Oh look." The man was staring outside the cave's entrance, his form awash in the glow of the setting sun. "The day's almost over. You know what sounds good right about now? Some dango. Should I send you home in time for dinner?" She couldn't believe her ears. "Home? Why not?" The man spun back around and approached Mayu with a kunai. She flinched, but in a smooth motion, he cut through her bindings. The broken rope tumbled down to her feet. Rubbing the bruises on her arms, she stared at him in disbelief. "Why are you letting me go? And where's Tajna-san?" "If you're referring to that old bridge builder, I released him a while ago." "But why? Why capture us in the first place at all?" "Tut tut." The man wagged his finger. "Too many questions, not enough escaping. What'll you do if Kakuzu-san comes back and you're still here?" He had a point. Mayu took a step towards the entrance and paused. "Thank you, whoever you are." The man bowed mockingly. "You can call me Toby." It was a scenario that Naruto had rehearsed in his head countless of times, the moment his teammates learned the truth about him. In the nights when he'd been unable to find anything else to occupy his thoughts, he'd approached it in many ways. Sometimes, he tried bringing it up on his own. Other times, he was cornered into revealing his secret. Whatever the approach, his teammates' imagined reactions always remained fairly constant. Rai erupted in anger and accused him of being a traitor, while Mayu either calmed him down or shrank back in terror. Now, it was actually happening, but in a way that Naruto, for all the thought he'd put into it, had never predicted. The first difference was that Mayu was not present, and at the reminder of her absence, Naruto felt a pang. The second difference was Rai's reaction: confusion, disbelief, realization, shock, horror. A myriad of emotions twisted his teammate's face, before melting away into one single, surprising emotion: concern. Then this is all a trap, isn't it? To get Naruto. Jiraiya nodded solemnly. Their objective is still unclear, but one thing's for certain. Several other Jinchuriki have already disappeared, and in all cases, there were signs of Akatsuki interference. I can personally confirm the current presence of 2 Akatsuki members here in this area: Hidan and Kakuzu. With Naruto here, this is no mere coincidence. At the names of the 2 missing nin, Naruto, who had been too stunned to respond, felt a jolt. That was another piece, falling into place. Then we must let Hokage-sama know, Shirakumo said sharply. This isn't just a matter related to Wave Country anymore, this now concerns the safety of our entire village. He motioned towards Naruto. He needs to be returned to Konoha immediately. Sai, who had been taking in the situation in shrewd silence, raised a hand. Using my super beast imitating technique, we can be back in Konoha before the end of the day. Wait, Rai protested. What about Mayu and Tajna? Before we can consider any rescue missions, Naruto's security comes first. What are you talking about? Trap or no trap, have you even seen him fight? He can take care of himself. Right, Naruto. With another jolt, Naruto realized that Rai had turned to him for backup. Rationally speaking, it was a no-brainer. Assuming that Jiraiya's intel was accurate and Akatsuki was a true threat, it would be senseless for Naruto to stay in Wave Country. He had not forgotten the results of his previous confrontation with Kakuzu. Despite Rai's confidence in him, he had been powerless then, and though he hated to admit it, he would be powerless now. The best option would be to return to Konoha with the rest of his team, alert the Hokage, and if possible, send out an elite rescue force. Although of course by then, it could be too late. Everyone else had fallen silent, waiting for his response. Rai's ferocious expression was starting to become undone, with the beginnings of fear taking its place. Naruto knew what was being asked of him. It had been a long time coming, ever since the day he and his teammates sat around a campfire in a dark crystal cave. The situation was almost comical. How had a simple bodyguard mission turned out this way? The Hokage had said it was a mission to help him gain experience, and if he did well, he would be considered for a position as a Jonin. A Jonin was a ninja who had the ability to make tough, split-second decisions in the face of conflict. The question was, which did he choose? The continued security of the rest of his team and the village? That was the smart, Jonin bet. Or would he gamble it all away for an unnecessarily high-risk rescue mission? He wondered what Kakashi would have done, and shook his head. It really was a no-brainer. Naruto cleared his throat. We're not leaving without them. It looked like he wouldn't be getting that promotion anytime soon. Leaving behind Shirakumo's genin team to guard the safe house, they immediately left the settlement. Luckily for the group, Jiraiya's earlier session with Zabuza's henchwomen had yielded several answers that were starting to prove more and more useful, mainly, the location of Geto's main hideout. It was situated in the middle of the marshlands, hidden from any uninformed eyes by dense mist. As they made their way through the forest, deftly hiding the sounds of their progress, the going was tense. The group's feelings were mixed on the matter, that much was obvious. While Shirakumo hadn't seemed too happy about the decision, he had bent his knee once Jiraiya showed his support. His face lined with apprehension, the Jonin accompanied them now in grudging silence. A Chunin who the others had called Sai wore a smile on his face like a mask. Jiraiya mentally marked him as one to watch. The other Chunin with the similar-sounding name Rai, was it? Though he was the most ordinary of the lot, he seemed equally the most driven in this rescue mission. Whether his enthusiasm would serve to be a hindrance or not remained to be seen. And finally, Naruto. Going by the reports Jiraiya had heard over the past several years, he wouldn't have expected such brashness from the boy. It seemed there was more of his mother in him than he'd thought. Jiraiya wasn't a fool. At a minimum, what awaited them were 3S-level missing nin. While he had confidence in his own abilities, even with a Jonin of Shirakumo's caliber and 3 skilled Chunin by his side, he had no doubt it would turn out to be a very close fight. However, though he would never admit this to the others, he was never one to pass up an opportunity to save a damsel in distress. Moreover, Naruto's decision on the matter intrigued him, and Jiraiya was willing to see where it took them. "Have you tried to control the Nine-Tails chakra yet?" he asked. Naruto's expression didn't change. Once. He left it at that. The boy didn't trust Jiraiya. He couldn't blame him. In all his years of absence, he was a complete stranger to Naruto. Of course, Jiraiya had his reasons. He'd been away under the Third's orders, tracking down and gathering information regarding Akatsuki. Nonetheless, it was an undeniable truth that he had neglected his duty as godfather. Perhaps, Jiraiya thought to himself, after all this was done and settled with, it was time that he trained the boy. The journey by ship had taken the better part of 3 days, but running at top speed across the water surface, Kakashi covered the same distance in a matter of hours. As soon as the mist began to fade and the coastline appeared in the horizon, he began his retrieval strategy. Kuchi Yasei no Jutsu, summoning technique. A black seal appeared momentarily on the water's surface, and in a cloud of smoke, his Ninken pack appeared by his side. Kakashi held out the only thing he had been able to find on the ship, a cloak that Naruto's shadow clone had presumably been wearing. "I'll need you guys to get to work right away." Once his hounds had the scent, they ran off ahead of Kakashi towards the main island. Reaching the shore, he immediately noticed the difference since he had last left it several days before. In the place of the once crowded, worn-down settlement, there was now a muted emptiness. Buildings appeared to have been smashed to pieces. What had been destitute before had been replaced by complete and utter abandonment. The only sign of activity was smoke, rising in the distance from the forest. Had there been an attack in the city? Where had everyone gone? Kakashi picked his way through the settlement, noting several strewn bodies in the rubble. Thankfully, none of them wore the leaf he ate. At the edges of the settlement, one of his hounds returned to him. "Did you get anything?" asked Kakashi. "There's a fresh trail that leads from the city and through the forest," said Pakun. "But I also found someone wandering around, with whiffs of the scent." Pakun led him deeper into the forest, and soon, Kakashi spotted an older bespectacled man leaning against a tree trunk for support. After a moment, he recognized him as Tajna, the man Naruto and the rest of his team had been staying with. "I'm not your enemy," Kakashi said, stopping before him. Letting out a surprised yelp, Tajna fell backwards and began scrabbling on the ground. "Who are you? Are you here to finish me off?" "I'm a ninja from Konoha, and I'm looking for Naruto and his team. Can you tell me what's happened and where they are?" The older man hesitated, his eyes squinting suspiciously at Kakashi's masked face. "They let me go, but they kept the girl. They told me to tell Naruto and the others. I have to find them now." Kakashi's heart skipped a beat. "They? Could you tell me where they are?" It was more difficult than Mayu had expected, getting through the marshlands. The joy she had felt when she had first left the cave had since dissipated into a rising sense of trepidation as the elements took a turn for the worse. The fog grew thick and heavy, and the air turned freezing. Continuing onwards, Mayu carried herself on thoughts of how her teammates would react when she reached the safe house. Rai would be the first to react. He'd be grinning widely, punching her on the shoulder for making him worry. Naruto would be standing to the side, not saying much as usual, but with a relieved look in his eyes and one less burden weighing him down. Once they were back in Konoha, she thought, she would have to buy them bowls of ramen to make up for it. Kakashi-sensei would be there too, and Rai would be complaining about Sai. Naruto would be. The mist was thick. Too thick. Mayu's heart began pounding. She remembered this fog. It was not natural. It was a ninjutsu. It had been how her captors had first gotten away. It all happened in the blink of an eye. One moment, she was alone in the fog with her thoughts. The next, she was flanked on both sides. An unnatural gust of wind blew away some of the nearby mist, revealing two dark figures, one tall and one short. Mayu felt hot bile rising in her throat, but she pushed it back. In a flash, she made the appropriate signs with her hands and an instant later, her bluebirds were unfurling themselves from her hair. "Naruto! Rai! Please find them. Drawing back in a defensive position, Mayu took in a deep breath. She wasn't completely defenseless, though she didn't have any of her weapons, she still had her genjutsu. She could buy some time with that. Her birds would dissipate the moment she died, but if it was the last thing she did, she would warn her team. That's it for part 5. Thank you for watching and see you in the next video.